Today this will be a relatively short video because after the dramatic events of the last few days with the fall of the important town of Popasnaya in the Donbass to the Russians, we are seeing still basically a redeployment of forces by the two militaries, the two armies, as they each prepare for what will, I suspect, be the latest blow in the incremental collapse of the Ukrainian forces in the northern Donbass. Now, I would, in light of that, as these redeployments occur, obviously information has slowed, the amount of information has slowed, though we still get news that the Russians and their allied forces are continuing to capture villages and settlements, tightening the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. Now, I've also seen a suggestion that the total number of Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, the garrison there that's been fighting to defend these two towns, is roughly 8,000, which would be analogous to the 8,000 Ukrainian troops that the Russian Defense Ministry has said were stationed in Mariupol at the beginning of the siege of that town. So it looks as if a second encirclement or tight encirclement of a Ukrainian force similar to the force that was garrisoning Mariupol is in the process of taking place, with Ukraine looking likely within some days, weeks, to lose more of its best troops defending a place, the Severodonetsk Lysychansk conurbation, which, if you look at the various situation maps, was clearly something of a salient. It was already heavily surrounded on multiple fronts by the Russian military and the allied forces from the Lugansk militia. And as a result, it was always also, it seems to me, undefendable. And as various people have been pointing out, and indeed, as I believe I myself have said in earlier programs, it never made much sense for the Ukrainians to keep their troops there. It always made more sense to pull them back to more defendable lines. The reason the Ukrainians kept their troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is, again, because they're clearly receiving these stand and fight orders from Kiev, which shows, if I have to say this, a reckless disregard for the lives of these soldiers, in a way that I have to say I find militarily baffling. I'm not a military person, but it really doesn't make any kind of sense to me from any kind of military aspect. I would have thought that you would want, if you're a commander, you would want to keep your army intact. And of course, I suspect the other factor is that Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and the settlements around are the last part of Lugansk region that Ukraine controls, and Ukraine doesn't want to seem or appear to have lost all of Lugansk region, because that would be another psychological blow, one accelerating the drift towards the breakup of Ukraine with the loss of the entire Donbass. Anyway, whatever the reasons, and they do all seem to me to have been political, it's now becoming increasingly clear that the condition, the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is rapidly becoming desperate. And here I'm going to say something further, which I had not appreciated, not being a military person and not being somebody who's able to read maps terribly well. As some of you may know, I have eyesight problems, so it's not easy for me to read maps. And of course, there are maps, and here one has to perhaps have more accurate maps or more detailed maps, which don't just give you an idea of where places are, but also of the general contours of the landscape. And this, of course, is something I hadn't done, but which has now been all very clearly explained to me, and which you can find more fully discussed in a video done by Jacob Dreisen, which you can find on the Dreisen report, and which you can also now find on our own channel, The Duran, in which he discusses, this is his latest video, in which he discusses this battle and the importance of Popasnaya and why its fall is consequential. Because it turns out that Popasnaya is on high ground. So it is apparently one of the tallest places in this part of the Donbass. So that means that if you station your artillery on Popasnaya, you can dominate with that artillery. And of course, the Russians have an overwhelming preponderance of artillery. You can dominate the surrounding landscape. And that puts you in a position where you can monitor and fire upon Ukrainian troops, both within the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, and of course also interrupt whatever supplies they may still have. So it seems that Popasnaya really was the hinge in Ukrainian defences in this area, and its fall has put the Ukrainian military in the northern Donbass in a critical position. It seems that it's rather like another settlement called Volnovacha in the southern Donbass, which was critical in defense of Mariupol, and whose loss and capture by the Donetsk militia paved the way for the full encirclement of Mariupol. So this gives us a sense of where the fighting is going. Now, I doubt that the siege of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk will be as protracted as the siege of Mariupol, because these are all industrial regions. It seems that there is not these huge factories and with their networks of tunnels in these two cities as there were in Mariupol. There is no exact analogy of the giant Azovstal steelworks, which was turned into a veritable fortress. I also get the sense that the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are troops of the regular Ukrainian military. They don't have some of the ideological motivations that some of the Azov fighters had in Mariupol. So I suspect that the fight in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk will not be as protracted. And in fact, yesterday there were reports that some Ukrainian troops, a Ukrainian brigade, or at least what's left of that brigade, has actually already retreated from Lysychansk, or has been trying to. Though it seems that, like most Ukrainian military formations in Donbass, it suffered heavy casualties and is essentially not in any very strong position to continue the battle. So a critical situation for the Ukrainians in Lugansk region. Indications, in fact, that Ukrainian defenses in the Lugansk region, in what's left of them, in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk area, are now in the early stages of what looks like an inevitable collapse. Another loss of 8,000 men trapped in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, adding to the heavy losses that Ukraine has already suffered elsewhere in the Donbass. And of course, once Severodonetsk, Lysychansk are cleared, and have fallen under the control of the Russians and their allies, that will in time release more Russian and allied troops to continue the offensives elsewhere. And it seems to me that when one looks at the overall situation in Donbass, it's increasingly clear that even in southern Donetsk region, there are, by the way, reports that the Russian offensive to cut the road between the town of the important city of Zaporozhye, and the Ukrainian forces stationed opposite Donetsk, that offensive is developing and may achieve some kind of breakthrough before very long, though it is apparently meeting intense Ukrainian resistance. But anyway, my overall sense is that before very long, we're going to start to see the whole position of the Ukrainian army start to crack, and perhaps retreats to the extent that they're still possible. It may not be easy for Ukrainian forces to retreat in Donbass, given that the sky is completely controlled by the Russian Air Force over Donbass. Anyway, given that that is so, I suspect that the Ukrainians, this is my guess again, I'm not a military person, but I would not be surprised if eventually Ukrainian forces try and concentrate in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and try to make what would in effect be their last stand. Anyway, talking of last stands, yesterday we had reports that all the civilians had been evacuated from the Azovstal steelworks. Today, the fighters who are still there have once again claimed that there are still perhaps 100 of these civilians still in the Azovstal steelworks. I am completely unsurprised by this, but regardless, one thing seems indisputable, that these troops in the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol are indeed now running out of food. And one does wonder how much longer they can keep fighting, they can keep going. All of the reports are that heavy shelling now as Azovstal and bombing of Azovstal by the Russians. And a journalist, Patrick Lawrence, has actually visited some areas of the Azovstal factory which have been captured by the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic and by the Russian military. So one way or the other, that first cauldron within the Donbass, within the larger cauldron, operational encirclement, if you like, in the Donbass, that first cauldron, which is Mariupol, it seems to me is likely to be finally and fully extinguished before long, and it's going to be joined by a second cauldron, the one in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. And in both cases, this has happened because the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian authorities, refused to do what I would have thought any responsible commander should do, which is to retreat from undefendable positions. They've thrown away, or are throwing away, the lives of their men to hold on to places which they cannot realistically be expected to defend successfully. And the Western media and Western governments, instead of criticizing them for doing this, are cheering them on. Well, on that topic, the remaining fighters in the Azovstal steelworks gave a press conference, a virtual press conference, in which even the Financial Times conceded that they made extremely scathing criticisms of the Ukrainian government, of the way they'd been betrayed. They spoke about the cynicism with which they'd been treated, and they're clearly extremely angry as they face the inevitability of either death or surrender. And I wonder how long it will be before other Ukrainian troops in Donbass start to think or feel the same way. If, of course, it is correct that they're being deceived about the progress of the war, then of course that will make their anger about the authorities in Kiev that are ordering them to hold out in undefendable locations. That will no doubt make them more angry still. And of course, it will make the civilians, their families, angry too. And we've now started to see scatterings of protests in Ukraine. They're not big, and they're not yet such as to cause the Ukrainian government any political worries, but they may be a harbinger of things to come. So we saw a protest a couple of days ago in Kiev by family members of the fighters in Azovstal, calling on the Ukrainian government to evacuate them in some way. And that protest was dispersed by the police. And we've also seen scattered protests in western Ukraine as the families of people who are conscripted or being conscripted protest against this, sensing that their menfolk are being sent to their doom, either death, captivity, or wounding in this grinding war in the Donbass. So I do wonder how much longer it will be before these protests start to gain force, because that, it seems to me, is where is the situation that the Ukrainian government is creating as a result of these stand and fight orders. Now, I want to follow up on this with that extraordinary battle over Snake Island, because the Russians have now provided a fuller account of what has happened. And I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it does seem that my discussion of it yesterday was reasonably accurate, in the sense that the Ukrainians made this attempt through amphibious landings, through airborne landings, through shellings, through all kinds of maneuverings to capture Snake Island, this small uninhabited island off the coast of Odessa, which, as far as I can see, has no great strategic significance, despite what people say. And we now get more information about the scale of the losses they suffered. And the Russians talk about 50 Ukrainian soldiers being killed, together with, no doubt, the pilots of an air crew of various Ukrainian aircraft which were shot down. And of course, the attack on Snake Island also provoked heavy retaliation by the Russian military against air bases and other facilities in Odessa, which will no doubt have caused more losses as well. There was a rather grisly detail from some of the Russian reports about 24 bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers being washed onto the shore of Snake Island. Well, of course, I can't confirm that, but the overall picture of a hideous debacle in this battle for Snake Island seems to be becoming clear. Moreover, the Russian report, and I am basing this on what the Russian Defense Ministry has published, and its official translation, appears to suggest that the Russians have not evacuated Snake Island, as was previously alleged, but have maintained some sort of physical presence there. Well, I can't confirm that, and maybe one shouldn't read too much into the exact words of what the Ministry of Defense in Moscow is saying. But one way or the other, this was a debacle. But the most interesting fact about this debacle is that the Russians claim that the order for it, the personal order to carry out this attack on Snake Island, came from no less a person than President Zelensky himself. Apparently, he instructed his military chiefs in Odessa to launch this attack on this island. Now, as far as I'm aware, President Zelensky is as uninformed, as inexperienced, as ignorant of military strategy as I am. I don't see on what possible basis he is the person to give direct orders to soldiers in battle. I accept that he's apparently presumably getting advice from the Ukrainian General Staff, and the Russian Ministry of Defense also spoke of the fact that there were British and American advisors who also assisted in the planning of this disastrous affair. But even if one allows for the fact that Zelensky is getting advice from someone, nonetheless, he is a politician, he is a civilian, he's somebody who does not have a military background. I don't think that he should be playing any part in giving instructions, giving orders to the military, any part in deciding anything of operational significance. Certainly, as speaking as a civilian, I think that even a civilian like myself, who's now getting all kinds of advice and information from people with military backgrounds, should never meddle in military affairs directly. I think that is completely inappropriate. Now, if this has happened, it confirms two things. Firstly, it confirms my view, which I expressed in the program that I made yesterday, that these advances, this attack on Snake Island, this fictional offensive in Kharkiv, in which apparently only a few hundred troops on either side are involved, that these offensives, these attacks, are not being carried out because they have any military or strategic importance. They are essentially PR exercises carried out for political reasons. In the case of the Kharkiv offensive and the attack on Snake Island, presumably to disrupt or spoil the atmosphere for Russia's May 9th victory parade. So, if Zelensky is involved, then again we see that brave men are being sent into battle not in order to achieve military objectives, but in order to achieve not even political objectives, but if you like, PR objectives. But the second point I want to make is that if, again, people like Zelensky, if it is the politicians in Kiev who are making or involving themselves in key operational decisions, then that makes this strange and ultimately self-defeating policy that we see in Donbass, and which we see specifically in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, this strange policy of ordering men not to stand and fight instead of retreating. There was opportunities offered by the Russians to remove the garrison from Mariupol, but Kiev rejected them. And I suspect there would be similar opportunities to do something similar with respect to the garrison in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, though I have to say my sense increasingly is that the Russians are becoming less and less keen to negotiate withdrawals in the way that they once were. But regardless, the fact remains, men are being ordered to fight in impossible battles, in impossible circumstances where they are about to lose. And if politicians, people like Zelensky, are making the decisions, well, it begins to become clear why. Now, ultimately, a war which is being fought by professionals on the one side and by amateurs, and Zelensky has to be an amateur, on the other, can only have one outcome. And whilst I'm on that topic, let me reiterate again, all the troops that are involved on the Russian side, in the Russian military, who are fighting in the Russian military are professional contract soldiers. There are volunteers as well. And of course, the militia from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, to a certain extent, are mobilized so that there is an element of conscription there. And of course, the Chechen fighters are also volunteers in some form. But overall, the bulk of the forces in Donbass, at least the Russian forces, are professional soldiers. Ukraine, it is Ukraine that is actually throwing conscripts into the battle. Something which, as I said, I don't think is well explained or clarified by the Western media. In fact, when I read the Western media, one gets the sense that the conscripts are only Russian. And it's somewhat elided that, in fact, the Ukrainian army, much more so than the Russian army, is a conscript army. But anyway, regardless of that, what we see is that amateurs seem to be running the Ukrainian side of the war, and conscripts increasingly seem to be fighting it. Now, Ukraine does have some professional soldiers, but my sense again is that a lot of them, most of them, the greater part of them, have been allocated to Donbass, where they have been stationed on the front line and are exposed to these stand and fight orders. So what the amateurs in Kiev are doing, or so it seems to me, is not just throwing away the lives of soldiers to no useful purpose, which I find deeply immoral and profoundly wrong, but also, and perhaps more seriously, throwing away the lives of Ukraine's best soldiers, which is not just immoral, but also ultimately self-defeating. It takes away that cadre of professionals without which a modern army cannot fight. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, the overall military situation. I suspect it will take some weeks before the forces in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk capitulate. The Ukrainian military so far is accepting orders from Kiev. There's no sign that any Ukrainian unit has disobeyed orders that come from the government in Kiev. So I suspect that if they're given orders to fight, to hold out in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, especially if these orders are supported by promises of relief, a relief which will never come, well, I suspect that those troops will fight on in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And it will be a disaster for Ukraine because these brave men will either die or be captured or will be wounded. And of course, it will be a human tragedy as well. But that's what happens when wars are fought in this kind of way. Anyway, that seems to me a reasonable summary of the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields. Meanwhile, the European Union, as we've also discussed, Alex Christoforou and I have recently discussed in a program which will be shortly up on the Duran. Meanwhile, the European Union seems to be determined to press on with its own economic self-destruction. So the European Commission seems to be determined to press forward with its plan to stop Russian oil imports. This is happening even as the Russians have apparently been successfully negotiating new oil deliveries to various East Asian countries, including China and India, but no doubt there'll be others as well. And rather bizarrely, the European Union has dropped a prohibition against tankers, EU tankers, shipping Russian oil. Now, I have a personal interest in this because most EU tankers, or most ships which are tankers, which are part of the European merchant marine, are actually Greek, or at least they're owned by Greek ship-owning companies. I believe something like 2/3 of them. And apparently what happened was that these shipping companies strongly objected to any such idea that they be prohibited from shipping Russian oil. And they were backed by the Greek government, and the EU Commission caved. So it does show that when some governments take a strong line on a policy like that, the EU Commission can pull back. They're not going to pull back, though, or so it seems, on the Russian oil import ban. And I suspect that in some form they're going to get it. So we're going to have the absolutely ludicrous situation where the European Union cannot access oil which is transported by its own ships, even as it experiences ever greater oil and fuel shortages within the Union, within the territory of the European Union. Now, if you can explain the logic of this to me, please do, because I can't understand it. I will be reading on the threads to find out what the logic is and how people explain this, I think, frankly, bizarre decision. But it's actually even weirder than this, because the reality is that European governments are going to need oil, and they're not going to get themselves into a situation where there is really no oil, or whether there are really big oil shortages in the European Union, such as would affect garages and petrol stations, and create queues and create shortages of diesel and all of this. So they're going to have to buy the oil from someone, and especially the heavy crude oil, which is so important for diesel oil. So whom are they going to buy it from? Well, the Saudis, the Gulf states, will produce some oil, but they've already said that there's limits to what they can produce. And besides, they produce mainly light oil, which is less suitable for conversion into diesel. The same, of course, is true of Nigeria, Angola, all these other places. So what they're actually going to do, I say this with total confidence, is that they're going to buy Russian oil. But of course, they're not going to buy Russian oil directly from Russian oil companies. They're not going to buy that oil, say, from Rosneft. They're going to buy it through middlemen. They're going to have this oil, if you like, laundered through the system until it arrives in Europe, and the Europeans will then pretend that it's no longer Russian. And of course, the aspect of this, which makes it even more bizarre, is that as this oil gets laundered, it will remain on the same ships. Because anybody who has had any experience in the shipping industry, which, by the way, I've done, though not to a very great degree, but I am fairly familiar with shipping law, and I remember how, I know how it works. Well, anybody who is familiar with all the, arcane world of bills of lading and all of that sort of thing will know that in practice and in fact, it is extremely difficult to control the movements of cargoes and to track them at all times. It can be done, but it requires time and effort. And of course, if the European Union is quietly importing Russian oil, or if EU member states are, and remember, enforcement of sanctions is the business of the EU member states, well, most of them will look the other way. So what you're going to have is an oil tanker, a Russian oil tanker. It will leave, well, presumably Murmansk or Vladivostok or one of these ports. It will then sail in the seas. It will then sell its the cargo on it, which will be oil, will be sold to customers in Malaysia, and then they'll be sold to customers in Japan, and then they'll be sold on to customers in who knows, the Philippines, Hong Kong, somewhere. And eventually, once it's gone through all of this long process, and it's been also to some extent probably blended with oil from other places, from the Gulf, who knows, eventually it will find its way to Europe. And that is what is going to happen. And I can say that as night follows day. I would also say that the people who are perhaps the most skilled at this sort of thing are the Greek ship owners who will be controlling these tankers. So in practice, the European Union will continue to import Russian oil. Only, of course, it will continue to import it at a much higher price. Because, obviously, if you're going to launder oil in this elaborate and complicated way, and I've made it far simpler, much simpler than it really is. But if you're going to do this, then believe me, the price of that cargo is going to multiply and increase, well, by orders of magnitude. But that's what's going to happen. So, we're going to have sanctions on Russia to prohibit the export to the EU of Russian oil. There will presumably be some restrictions, some restrictions on these sanctions, some provisions to allow Hungary and Slovakia and Bulgaria and all of those to continue to import Russian oil directly from Russia, as they're doing at the moment, at least for a while. But overall, we will probably be getting this sanctions package. But in practice, we will still be importing Russian oil. Only we are going to have to pay much more for it than we probably would have done previously. Of course, it's not the Russians who will be pocketing the extra price, though they will be pocketing some of it, because in a time of oil shortage, the price of oil will always be higher than it would otherwise have been. And of course, some of that will end up in Russian hands. Some of the money for that expensive oil will end up in Russian hands. I mean, the middlemen will be prepared to pay more for that Russian oil because they know they can sell it at an even higher price to the European Union. But anyway, in the European Union. But anyway, the people who are going to benefit most from this are the middlemen. The Greek ship owners, the various merchants and brokers and all of these people. Some of this is quite a complex and curious world, not all of which is based in London, contrary to what many people think. Anyway, these people are going to make a killing. They are going to make a huge amount of money out of this sanctions package. So the Russians will get some money for their oil, the middlemen will get a huge amount of money, and the people who will be, well, frankly, made to pay will be the EU's consumers. I mean, it doesn't make any kind of sense to me whatsoever. But that is what the EU governments, what the Commission seems determined to do. Of course, it will all come with brave words about how various steps are going to be taken to prevent these transfers happening. I suspect it'd be very much like what has happened with gas for rubles. Everybody, apart from the Hungarians and a few others, says publicly that they're not doing it, that they're not participating in this gas for rubles scheme. In practice, as we know, nearly all of them, apart from the Poles and the Finns and the Balts, actually are. And the same will happen with this oil trade. There'll be all sorts of people, all governments, all oil companies in Europe will be saying, oh, no, under no circumstances, we will not touch this Russian oil. And we'll be doing all these strong enforcement measures. We're going to have all these police agencies set up, more money, by the way, to spend on things like that. We'll have all these police agencies set up to track where all the oil is going, to make sure that no Russian oil reaches the EU. And in practice, they will all, in reality, look the other way, even as that oil comes to the European Union. Well, I don't, as I said, again, see the logic of any of this. It doesn't make any sort of sense to me. But, as I said, where there is demand, sooner or later there is supply, especially if the supply is available. And given that the EU needs heavy Urals crude, the EU is going to get heavy Urals crude, except, of course, it's going to pay much more for it than it would otherwise have done. Well, if that's a rather cynical take, believe me, it's based on experience. I've seen these things happen before. I was obviously not personally involved, but I heard lots of stories about what was happening with Iranian oil, for example, and Iraqi oil before that. So, you know, this is not something that I'm talking about which I don't already know quite a lot about. And by the way, it seems that Russian oil production, after a steep fall in March, is now growing again, which perhaps tells you a lot about the fact that the Russians are finding customers for their oil. So, a military strategy being followed by Ukraine in Donbass, which makes no sense to me, and a sanctions strategy being followed by the EU, which also makes no sense to me. If anybody, as I said, can explain the logic of either, well, I invite you to do so in the thread to this video. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Future programs both on this channel and on our main channel, The Duran. Remember, you can find us on multiple platforms. You can find us on Rumble and Locals. And of course, if you go to Rumble and watch any of our videos there, and you go to the red maroon button, which you'll see at the top of the video, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where we publish exclusive content, and where you will see that I do live streams exclusive to Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And of course, we're present on other platforms, SuperU, Odyssey, and others as well. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also come to our shop and buy the amazing things, the many amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, all those great things. And of course, if you also want to support our work, well, please remember in that case to tick the like button to this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a great day until then.